Also Dr. Adab at the time.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the seminar on historical roots of Ta'lim and Adab and developing new methodologies. I'm Islam, International Outreach Coordinator at İLKE Foundation. We are delighted to have two distinguished scholars with us, Talal Al Azem from Cambridge Muslim College and Fehmi Baysan from Ibn Khaldun University. Today's seminar aims to provide a comprehensive understanding of Ta'lim and Adab, points out their relevance in contemporary educational landscape and exploring how can we develop new methodologies to enhance ethical development. To begin the program, we will first show a promotional video that highlights the mission and activities of the İLKE Foundation. So let's watch.
And back in the 1980s, but the establishment of the İLKE Foundation has proved to be culturally important. Foundation for Science, Culture, and Education, İLKE, was established with the purpose of keeping Islamic and humane values alive and being instrumental in promoting them. Simultaneously, we have supported the establishment of several beneficial organizations, which have grown massively in their size and operations over time. More recently, we have grown into a world institution that is further advancing work in the betterment of the society. For several associations and research centers it operates as a premier institution of research and development in Turkey. We feel the possible society has regularly conduct research and promote policies and strategies to place the struggle for the policymakers and direct them towards the right track. We regularly prepare technical reports in the field of economy, education, business ethics, civil society, and law. İLKE is a platform for using intelligence and organizations with this orientation, and for regularly host conventions, analysts, and scholars of the international nature to discuss and develop the contemporary issues facing the Muslim world. And as the challenges of the present world is facing, we feel a personal need for collaboration with organizations to share and regularly visit civil society organizations, think tanks, and economic institutions in different countries to undertake joint projects in various fields. Cognizant of the importance of modern methods and technology in this age of information, we have a dedicated studio as well as multiple online platforms, including İLKE that are enriched with news, opinion articles, and analysis about issues on the agenda of Turkey and the whole world. Four research centers operate under one roof. The Research Center for Islamic Economics, ICA, provides the production of competent ideas and theories on the overall construction of the Islamic economy thoughts, bringing together experts in the field from the country and the world and exchange knowledge through its publications and events. As Research Center for Education Policy, NEPA, we are creating a new perspective in the field of education. We conduct field research, produce analysis reports, and draft policies with a needs-oriented, data-based, and inclusive approach in the field of education. The Research Center for Social Thought and Policy, TELA, we conduct data-based, realistic, and beneficial research, publications, and events for positive social change. Our Civil Society Academy, STM, trains and enhances the capacity of civil society organizations. We organize trainings and events for the development of dynamic and directing NGOs. We have three member associations that operate under ILKE: Informal Education and Cultural Association, ILKE, producing original models and materials based on the idea that raising morally and spiritually consistent generations depends on providing the same religious education service in our society. It prepares publications and conducts activities in order to prepare to write human resource for qualified educators. Turkey Entrepreneurship and Business Ethics Association, EGAT, encourages entrepreneurship and works to enhancing business ethics. It aims for a right-oriented business and therefore focuses on disseminating moralities of participants economic life. Owing to its activities, publications, and events like Business Ethics Summit and the Turkish Journal of Business Ethics, India has an impactful position in the field. Mathematics Studies Association, ILKE, provides basic and advanced research, training, and application activities to inculcate a genuine and authentic scientific approach toward knowledge creation. Taking inspiration from our scientific tradition, its main goal is to contribute through its magazines, projects, and publications to create an approach that will encompass all of the humanity, serving the whole humanity through research centers and institutions with strong principles and quality publications. İLKE Foundation, serving the whole humanity through our research centers and institutions with strong principles and quality publications. İLKE Foundation.
Thank you for watching. Now, I would like to invite Ayhan Öz, the director of İLKE's Education Policy Research Center, to deliver the opening speech. Floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to İLKE Foundation. I am the director of the Research Center for Education Policies affiliated with the İLKE Foundation. Today, with our two esteemed guests, we will address an important topic within the Islamic educational tradition. I hope the seminar will be beneficial for all of us. We have distinguished guests, Talal Al Azem and Vehbi Baysan. I would like to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Öz, for your kind wishes. Our seminar is starting. I would like to invite our speaker and moderator to the stage. Please join me welcoming Talal Al Azem and Vehbi Baysan. Let me introduce the speaker before starting. Dr. Talal Al Azem is academic director of the Cambridge Muslim College. His research focuses on social and intellectual history of the Muslim world, with particular attention to institution of law and learning in medieval and early modern Near East. Dr. Baysan serves as an assistant professor at History Department of Ibn Khaldun University. Dr. Baysan received his PhD from University of Manchester in Middle Eastern Studies. His research focuses on history of Islamic education. Now, we can start the seminar. Floor is yours, Mr. Baysan.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. It's really exciting for me because all I thought was I am one of the few in the field of education, or rather history of education in Islam. My PhD is on the Tanzimat era, Tanzimat, the reform era, and what they wanted to do with education in terms of social engineering. Then, Hocam, I was asked by one of the universities in the UK, they said, we know nothing about Ottoman education. Can you prepare a book? I said, well, there must be quite a lot. I checked, there was none. And then I started preparing. Then I was concerned, alarmed, and became nervous because people would say, well, the Ottoman education did not come by parachute. So there must be a kind of khalfiyya, there's a background for it. So I said, let me do a bit of research, try Ottoman, and then I'll go continue. That was 4 years ago, and I'm still there. I couldn't get out of it. Why? That's why I'm excited today that I have a distinguished guest. At least we can discuss and hopefully display that field, how should be studied. First of all, we have the same discourse repeating itself. First, we love ilm, no doubt. And then we have sufa, and we have halakha. And that full stop. Anything else anybody can add? First centuries, you cannot add much. So I started reading the manuscripts. You cannot find it in English nor in Turkish. They're all beautifully written in Arabic. Actually, telling us a different story, how children were educated, how children were given a moral education. And since then, I even turned it into a very nice class, a course, History of Education in Islam, and hopefully students enjoying studying because a lot of them coming to my class. So today, I'm hoping with Professor Talal Al Azem to discuss these first centuries, and then if we can make some, not recommendations, because we're historians, we don't look into future. Okay, so if you ask anything about future, we'll pull you back to history because we're historians. But history teaches us a lot. So let's see how we benefit. I will give you the floor. You do the muqaddimah, but we don't want the muqaddimah to be as long as Ibn Khaldun's muqaddimah. Yeah? So that we can actually divert and convert. After that, we can go into questions and answer session. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Well, first of all, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu Wassalam ala Rasulillah. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome by our hosts here. And it's a great honor to actually be sitting here with Professor Wahbe, someone who, again, has dedicated his life to this very topic. In many ways, I'm an interloper. I began with my interest in education, diverted for over a decade and a half into more legal elements. Starting with education, legal education, but getting more and more into jurisprudence. And it's only been in the past about 8-9 years that I've slowly made my way back in again. So this also is a very great opportunity for me to explore and to learn both from our conversation and from the questions that we have here today. When it comes to the question of education, of course, since you mentioned the Tanzimat, perhaps one of the greatest outputs from the period of the 1800s, of course, is the Majalla al-Adliya. And one of the very first words mentioned in the Majalla is al-umuru bimaqasidiha. And so we should always begin, I would recommend, in thinking about any question, but especially the question of education, which is, what are the ends? What are the objectives? What are the maqasid of which any society, any educational system, historical or contemporary, since we're being tasked with a little bit of gazing into our crystal ball into the future here this afternoon as well. What are some of the bases of any educational system? And if we're speaking about the history of education in the Muslim world, which we are this evening, then I'd suggest we begin with 3 questions, and then we'll take these questions into our historical treatment. And the very first question is, what is the highest end, or what is the ultimate maqsad, the objective of the educational process as a process? What are you trying to produce? Because every educational system ultimately produces a certain type of human being. The second question is, how is this process envisioned? In other words, what type of educative journey will this human being, be they young or they be old in a university setting, for example, what type of journey will they undertake? What type of journey is needed to be constructed or engineered in order to produce the type of person that we spoke about in the very first question? And then finally, what types of institutions need to be crafted in order to achieve these ends? So in other words, what's the objective? What kind of human being are we trying to produce? What type of relationship of student to teacher or other means of producing this person? And finally, when we're speaking at a societal historical level, from a socio-historical level, what are the institutions that any given society produces for that? Because if we look at the types of institutions that we dominate, for example, globally today, let's take as an example the modern research university, the genealogy of which is only about 150 years old. This is a very different type of university, though we use the same word, than the universities of the 16th and 17th century in the same countries in which today the research university exists. In other words, the society had said at some point, consciously or otherwise, we need a new type of institution to produce a different type of person to fit within the vision of that society. So if your primary aim as a society is, let's say, economic, if the measure of success is economy, then clearly your primary objective is going to produce somebody who will contribute to that type of economically premised society. If your primary purpose is something different, and perhaps as part of our discussion, we can explore what that may have meant in the earliest centuries and throughout the centuries of the Islamic world, then a different type of institution will be created in order to produce a different process, which will produce a different type of human being. So these are some of the broad frameworks, I think, at a more philosophical level or conceptual level that I would suggest that we maybe bring into our conversation in the concrete terms of history.
I also just go in as moderating, but I'm not moderating. I want to hear more what you have to say. But one of the earliest texts we have, anybody can tell me? Anybody showed interest on those? History of education in Islam. What would be the earliest text? Where it comes from? Any idea? Abu Hanifa. I strongly recommend you read his student Al-Maqatil and his dialogue. We understand from there we are in the 1st or 2nd century Hijri, and you can see that the professor and the learner, the alim and muta'allim, in fact, they converse. They just talk to each other. They ask questions to each other. So usually al-alim, which happens to be Abu Hanifa, answers back. Over there are a lot of, I think, significant points that we can carry to today. One method I would recommend is, it's not the class environment, because our traditional teaching takes place in conversation, rather than professor coming and talking and then leaving. And second of all, you can see that Abu Hanifa is opening the gates to his students for further learning. From that point, when we come to what kind of a person, kind of Islam, or rather the fiqh or kalam, try to produce, probably would be your area to answer. I know it's difficult.
So this is an excellent question. I think if I may take as the starting point the period of Abu Hanifa, since you mentioned this as your entry into the topic. If you look at the understanding of what an alim, person of knowledge, or what we translate as a scholar, was, through much of the history of the Islamic world, but especially at that juncture, pre-institutionalization of the form that we now recognize in the 5th and 6th centuries after the madrasas of Nizam al-Mulk and others spread. In this rather pre-institutional period, we still had an understanding that the alim was meant to unify within their person all the different branches of knowledge, not that they were discrete disciplines, though of course in the pedagogical sense you would pursue individual disciplines, but fundamentally you are not an alim unless these disciplines were integrated holistically within the individual. Not merely even at an intellectual level, but as comes through in some of the writings from that time period, even those individuals, but even with what we might call within a larger worldview, or you might say within a spiritual perspective. And by spiritual here, I don't mean specifically Sufism, as it came to be defined in the 3rd century of Islam. But what I mean by this is rather what is the meaning that is attributed, what are the ma'ani that are attributed to any sphere of existence or any sphere of human activity. Why do I mention these two things? At the level of existence, what the later Kalam tradition develops as al-umur al-amma, from Fakhruddin al-Razi's time and onwards, this is the question of ontology, seeing things as they truly are. And this has always been one of the measures of whether an educational system in the Islamic world was successful? Does it help produce someone who can actually see reality objectively as it is? Because, as of course, everyone here in the room is better aware than even I. If you look at some of the later writings in Kalam, such as that of Al-Nasafi, the very first words is للأمور حقائق or للأمور حقيقة. It's a realist tradition, ontologically, philosophically speaking. The second aspect then of this integration is to understand human activity. So the world around us and exploring it through all types of means, what we would today call scientific or sociological or any other realm. But then also the second dimension is exploring that which is within the human being. And here the primary, and this is where the starting point of the professor's quote is correct, Abu Hanifa, of course, is known as a faqih. We often translate fiqh as law, and this is not incorrect. But there's perhaps a deeper meaning to fiqh, or a corollary in the medieval Christian tradition, which is that of moral theology. In other words, determining what is the right action in any given moment. And the ability to determine right action, if I put it in theological terms, what does God want of me at this moment, at this exact juncture in time, is the purpose or the objective of the faqih. But in order for this faqih, for this jurist like Abu Hanifa or others, to be able to address this or to determine it, it means that they have to first understand, again, the world around them, the relationship of the world to the divine, to God, and their place in this relationship as human beings. And this is where the morality, the moral education comes into it. Because to be a human being in the Islamic vision means to be mukallaf, means to be a moral agent who is legally and morally responsible for their actions. Responsibility is premised upon the notion that you have intelligence, aql, that you have age, maturity, majority, bulugh. But ultimately, what all of these lead to is a vision that the human being, as God's vicegerent or khalifa on earth, because again, Abu Hanifa was not looking at this simply from a legal perspective. He was looking at it within a more civilizational perspective, the premise of which fundamentally is the Quran. Looking at the human being as this khalifa, meaning the human being now is the nexus between the divine and between the world. And this nexus means that the human being, in Abu Hanifa's view, and in the view of all the scholars who expand upon this tradition, is, again, a morally accountable and responsible agent. And I think this is why you see two particular trends attributed to Abu Hanifa. You have al-fiqh al-akbar and you have al-fiqh al-asghar. The fiqh al-akbar is not moral theology, it's not law. It's what we understand in the broader sense as speculative theology, what later becomes known as kalam. And the minor fiqh, so to speak, that sits underneath that is what we today refer to as fiqh, which is, again, this moral theology. How am I meant to behave towards the divine, ibadat, in marriage, munakahat, in business transaction, muamalat, etc., in all of these categories. So to bring it back into more historical terms and allow you to build from there, I think what's very interesting about these dialogues that Professor Wahbi cited to begin with, and you see this whether in the dialogues of Abu Hanifa with this particular student, or indeed in some of the early writings of Ibn Sahnun and others, when they report from their own teachers the types of discussions or dialogues that they had. This whole tradition, of course, develops as ilm al-jadal, as the dialectic. But the fundamental point here is that knowledge is something that is both objective, but also to be cultivated from within. And the art of dialogue, it's the art of discussion as we're having now, is one of the primary means by which to do both, to connect the individual back to that whole, or the juz'a to the kull.
But what I really love there is when his student, he also a mature student, of course, and he's an imam, tells his professor that they are criticizing him saying that why are you interested in topics that the Sahaba did not show interest? It's a very critical question, and he repeats it twice. So Abu Hanifa, when answering, he says, well, look, tell them they're all right, but say also that if I lived at the time of Sahaba, I would think like the way they did. But now time changed, time passed. So it's almost 100 years later. So that demonstrates how Abu Hanifa is not shutting down the gates of thinking and the knowledge, because ta'lim al-Quran, but important keyword is ta'lim, faridatun ala kullu musliman musliman. Also, hadith says, I'm quoting from Ibn Sahnun, خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. So here we have the process of learning and teaching. But I think the fundamental thing I want to just bring here is ilm, learning in a way. And I will say something often people find provocative. In Quran, only one place, only in one instance, the equality between the Muslims changes. Anyone can tell me where? In Quran, one place when one الذين يعلمون, isn't it? Those who actually know, but know we should take it as learn, which means you have the chance to go and learn it. Now, Ibn Sahnun died in 255, so we're talking about 3rd century. His contemporary, he lived in Qayrawan, Ibn Sahnun, but his contemporary Jahiz died 1 year later in Basra. They both tried to reorganize children's education, but I want to bring up, they strongly emphasize not only ta'lim, but also ta'dib, which is adab or adab later, edeplendirme ya da terbiye etme. So let's take it because you have published on this issue as well.
This connects, I think, directly to what we were discussing just a few minutes before. So the element of ta'lim, as Professor Wahbi has highlighted, has this aspect of inculcating positivistic knowledge. In other words, knowledge that's objective, that can be discussed, can be argued about, and ultimately can be passed on and cultivated as well. In other words, it can be expanded upon. Ta'deeb, by its very root meaning, has the sense of an internal virtue, something which you are transforming the person from a state of immaturity to a state of maturity. And this is why the word is used not just for the cultivation of human beings, but if a person has a horse and the horse is a bit wild, they'll say adaba. He changed that horse from a state of wildness to a state of being.
Still use it in Turkish.
And so this element here is very important because, as Professor Rafi said, it's a dialectic between the two. And it's the sense of ta'deeb, in other words, creating a person of adab, that connects to what we were discussing a few minutes earlier, which is a person who knows how to do the right thing at the right time. This is one of the definitions actually given of adab, a proper etiquette or doing the right thing, which is doing the right thing at the right time. So it's a matter of, in other words, internal virtue of the intellect and of the soul. Because within, again, this unified vision of the human being, implicit within the Quran, made explicit by the various ulum at this time and later, the integrative knowledge, nature of knowledge means that a person cannot actually be a scholar if they were not virtuous. It was deemed to be a condition of knowledge to have moral virtue. Without it, to go back to our earlier point, you do not see things as they truly are. Because in this vision, to use the language of the Quran that many of the early writers on education spoke about, if there is a covering on the heart, as the Quran says, if there's a veil on the heart, This veil means that you will not perceive the reality of things. You might see things in front of you, but you don't understand what they're getting at. You don't get the meaning. There's no ibra. There's no reflection. And so when it comes to this educational process from childhood into maturity, ta'aleem, meaning the positivistic transfer and inculcation of knowledge in a person, which might be done through teaching and lectures, the dars. It might be done through dialogue, as we saw in the example that was mentioned earlier. It might be done through bahth and munazara, which becomes a discipline in and of itself. All of these things are forms of ensuring that a formal positivistic knowledge, be it in law, be it in theology, be it in medicine, be it in astronomy, these ensure that the cumulative knowledge of the community, of the society, is not lost. I mean, again, imagine there was no universities where you could study medicine. You have to start every generation from scratch. This would not be a society. It would not be a civilization. So this positivistic knowledge transfer of ta'aleem, beginning from a young age, 3 years old, 4 years old, beginning with learning the Quran, learning language, learning arithmetic. But interestingly, the name of the teacher of the young children was mu'addib. In other words, indicating that perhaps the most important thing that the teacher could teach them was this adab, was this proper disposition towards reality, towards the divine, towards one another, the teacher, towards their fellow students, towards their society, but even towards their own selves. In other words, if you look then through the writings of scholars who write about, let's say, Adab al-Alim al-Muta'allim or Adab al-Ta'aleem, they often go through all the different categories of which a student will interact. The teacher is a given. Their students, the books that they engage with, need their very own selves. Now, when a different tradition developed here, which is the Tasawwuf tradition. But I want to mention this point because many times, if you look at authors such as in the 8th century, Ibn Jama'ah from Cairo, the same author who is writing about Adab al-Ta'aleem wal-Muta'allim in his Tadhkirat al-Sami', for example, was also himself a murid or a follower of a Sufi sheikh. And he himself wrote about this internal cultivation of the soul. So in other words, the outward, the ta'aleem, and the inward, the adab, were never seen as being two separate spheres. You spoke about them separately like you speak about any discipline of physics separate from biology. But when it comes to application, or when it comes to reality, of course, there is no actual separation between them in the real phenomenal world. And so the educational system that developed in these early centuries always emphasized this point. Now, the one thing that perhaps, before turning back to Professor Wahbe, that I'd like to just underscore is that, again, these fundaments are found from the very earliest texts. But it's only really when you have the rise of the madrasa in the 400s, in the 5th century. There's some discussion whether it's first in Afghanistan or first in Cairo or first in Spain. But the point is, as a phenomenon, what's agreed upon is that they arise in the mid-5th century of the Hijrah. And the most famous spread, of course, is that of the Nizamiya, to begin with, madrasa system. But it's at this juncture, remembering again that colleges are not what we think of today. Colleges, the average age of entry to college was 13, not 18. In other words, there was a primary ta'deeb education, but beyond that, immediately then into what we deem today to be a higher education. And this is not just in the Muslim world, but likewise in medieval Latin Europe, it was the same. The average age of entering was 13 or 14 years old. But the point being here is now you have a shift. In this 400s, in the 5th century of the Hijrah, you have a shift. You have now a new thing that the student has to have an adab with, which is the institution itself. And so you have the rise of a new genre of pedagogical literature and moral literature talking about what is the proper adab or relationship between the student and not just the teacher, not just their fellow students, but with the institution itself. Because institutions provide benefits, but also dangers. And the authors wrote about this. One of the greatest dangers that they discussed was that with professionalization and institutionalization, there becomes now new temptations. The temptation for pursuing knowledge simply for the sake of wealth, because now you can be a professor, go from city to city and city to city, and have a secure career as a professional scholar. Whereas just 300 years earlier with Abu Hanifa, as we all know, Abu Hanifa was a trader, a businessman. There was no notion of a professional educationalist or teacher or scholar. So the rise of these institutions of education led to new reflections on the very purpose of education. It forced them to think about what is the adab now in an age of institutions. How do we raise this student, this young human being, into being a mature human being? Through knowledge can guide society, can ensure that all the different branches of knowledge ultimately reintegrate again, so society is coherent. But how do we do this through this new institution called the college or the madrasa?
Well, the first madrasa, when we say first, again, very provocative, because people say, don't we have it before? Here, what Hoja is describing, Nizamiye Madrasa, is the first institutionalized madrasa financed by the state or Kadife, and the students got pocket money and professors got salaries. Before that, we don't have such a thing. We have, of course, madrasas, but Ibn Khallikan explains us, saying that if there is a person wants to learn, and if there is a person wants to teach, wherever this interaction takes place, let it be under a palm tree, that's madrasa. You see, that's the description of madrasa. So don't look for any other explanation. Here, mu'addib teaches students tarbiyah in today's term. Mu'addib teaches ta'dib. Let me give one example. I hope we're not running out of time. Students in the past used to have slate, levha, and they would write over it like a chalk or something, probably a kol, kömür parçası. In order to teach them respect, because these are Quranic words, each child used to bring some water and they would put it in a tas called ijane. Do you know the term? This Ibn Sa'd, I love that word, ijane. And then once the writing finishes, they wash what they wrote, Quranic words, with that water from ijane and pour it in a small hole on the ground and cover it. And nobody would step on it because these are Quranic letters. I really love the story. Fast forward, we have Qabisi talking about education, 4th century. And when we come to 5th century, we have institutionalized. By the way, the first Nizamiye Madrasa did not open in Baghdad. I was reading geographer Qazwini. He tells us that it was in Nisabur and tells us the whole story. Anyway, when we are in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, we have a totally different world and have very interesting topic. I'm now trying to turn it into a project. Is, you know, talib comes from talib al-ilm, and how their mobility took place is very interesting. For example, we have Zarnuji. I really recommend you should read Zarnuji, coming from Central Asia somewhere. The town called Zarnuj doesn't exist now, beyond Samarkand and Bukhara. How this kid actually made his way to Bukhara and then Samarkand and then ended up being in Andalus. It means there was a proper system supporting these kind of trips or journeys. Now, from here, by the way, when I said Zarnuji, it was in 1621, translated into the Latin. And I found the book. The translator telling the Christian world, he's a priest, saying, this is the Islamic education and methodology. Please, I translated into Latin, learn it, read and memorize it, and treat it like a baby. Because this baby will be enlightening our future. Look at it. The reference is Islamic. Zarnuji, very famous in that education. And even the Christian world trying to learn something from it. Let's fast forward. When we come to Ottomans, we have more like a larger kulliya or the university style establishments, let's say. First, Ottoman madrasa was opened where? Anybody knows? And when, I'm going to ask? Iznik, 1333. The language of education was Arabic, of course. That gave the opportunity, all the ulama, wherever they are, from Egypt, from anywhere in the Islamic world, they can come and teach in Arabic. After that, we have Süleymaniye and Fatih. First, Sahn-ı Seman in Fatih, and then Süleymaniye. How this kind of madrasa under state control, but also you have independent scholars everywhere on the Islamic world. Let's talk about that more and how the concept of adab and ta'lim changed.
So indeed, if you look over this broad sweep of history that we were just provided over these centuries, you do see a notable change from whether it's under a tree or often in a mosque or in a khan just attached to the mosque, often in the scholars' homes, sometimes in libraries, sometimes in hospitals. All of these locations were locations of teaching and of education. But with, again, the rise of the madrasa as a patronized, waqf-based institution in which the waqf ensured a continuity.
Well, I think the keyword is patronized, isn't it? That's, yes. I think
and this is the key.
Should be understood.
Yes, the key
sponsored and
sponsored, in some cases pre-Ottoman by the state, but more often than not by the individuals who may have been statesmen, but not directly from the state. In other words, working in their own personal capacities, because many of them, for example, again, using the example of Nizam al-Mulk, he himself was a product of one of the eastern, what is today Afghanistan, madrasas pre the Nizamiya system. But I think what's important to note in this is that even then with the rise of a state-supported educational system like we see with the Almiya in the Ottoman realm, and you see similar things happening, for example, under the Mughals in India. Nonetheless, the relationship between the teacher and the student remains the primary relationship. Let's compare that today to where if you think of signing up for education, you sign up to an institution. If you're doing a doctorate, you usually seek out a particular supervisor. But at the end of the day, your ijazat, your certificate, is not from the teacher. It's from the institution. This remained until the modern period, even throughout the early Ottoman period, this remained the reality. In other words, the institutions provided the space. And in many ways, one of the main contributions in early modernity of the Ottoman world was in ensuring that there was a stable curriculum. There were known references in texts that were deemed to be the sulam, or the ladder through which one developed. But it remained the case that the relationship, the fundamental relationship, was of human to human, not of human to abstract corporate institution. And this is why, despite the fact that you have these complexes in Timurid Iran, or in Anatolia, or later in India, that look like what we imagine today physically to look like a university. In other words, a complex with many departments, many different areas of study. Nonetheless, as historians have argued over the past 50 years or so, George Maqdisi being perhaps the most famous of them, these were not universities. Why? Because each of these different faculties had their own waqf, their own patronization. Which meant what? It meant that the relationship remained, again, importantly, a relationship of student to teacher, human to... Now, the one student may have many, many teachers, and thus many, many ijazat. But the madrasa becomes the place where this is facilitated. Now, why do I focus on this? Because it means that it remains very human. If we see as I think we could argue analytically, to use this term analytically, education is a craft. What is the difference between a craft and any other form of industrial production? A craft means that there's a human touch. There's human intelligence of an individual being applied onto the material. If I'm a craftsman of wood, you can see my personality, so to speak, in my carving of the wood that you can't see when it's machine made. The machine has other virtues, perhaps, efficiency, speed, scale. But you would never say this is a personalized piece. That personalization comes from human interaction. And I think this is where, if you see what's unique through all of Islamic civilization, from the earliest period of the Ahl al-Sufa, all the way up until really the 1800s, until the reforms start to really kick off in Egypt, in the Ottoman realm, in British India and elsewhere, and then from there in Tunisia and Damascus and Mecca and in other places. What you see throughout that 1,000 years, basically, 1,200 years, is you see that education is a craft. Education is an art. And art means that there's the individual human touch to the soul of that student being cultivated, that tarbiyah that's being done. Whether it's, again, in medicine or in astronomy or in fiqh or in speculative theology or any of the other disciplines, in mathematics, the ta'deeb that you're referring to is ensured because of that human relationship, not the institutionalized relationship, not the industrialized in our modern sense education. Many students today, especially in the age, we're starting to veer a little bit into the future, so maybe it's a good segue from here into some of the questions. If you think about education, for those of us who are educationalists, who work in universities over the past 6 years, when COVID hit, especially, you have people behind screens. I know myself, it was a very frustrating period. You can't even see your students. They don't turn the cameras on. They might as well just be a number. There's no human connection. And in many of the major universities around the world today, if you look in China, where again, industrialized education has been taken to the next level, again, there's a very minimal human-to-human relationship. It's very much an industrial form of education. This is something that I would argue, if you look at the broad sweep of Islamic history, but you also look at what they wrote. And so we go back again to the maqasid, al-umuru bi maqasidiha that we started with. This was intentional. This was not an accident. It wasn't that they didn't have the means. It was that for them, education without that tarbiyah, without that ta'deeb, was no education at all. Because without it, you don't ensure that the moral ultimately serves as a restraint to the intellectual brilliance of the human being. An example from the modern period, if I will, just from, how long ago was that now? 16 years ago. The 2008 stock market crash, which was, of course, the result of some of the most brilliant minds educated in the best institutions of economic thought in the West, in the world. But there was one very important thing missing, not from my assessment, but from the assessment of many of those in the world of economics who were writing about this in finance, was there was no moral restraint on their brilliance. In other words, greed drove the development of new financial instruments that didn't take the human beings into consideration. In other words, they were just abstract things until the moment comes that they couldn't afford their homes anymore. The subprime mortgage crisis is what triggered in America, from one small little issue, which is mortgages on houses, a global financial crisis. What was the issue with these subprime mortgages? You had brilliant economic minds without any moral restraint. And this is something that I would argue, if you look at the sweep of Islamic history, and especially at the writings of the theory of education, this was something they were adamant about. You cannot separate the ta'deeb and the ethics and the moral from the knowledge, be it in the person or in the society. And the moment you do so, knowledge is fragmented. Knowledge is broken, and the societies will end up manifesting types of illnesses that only happen when there's a fragmentation at a societal level.
Well, we have, I think, a few minutes for questions, but I will end with Darimi or Ajuri, those two I really love, saying that knowledge, knowing, ilm, does not give you the right for mufadala, which means that doesn't make you superior in front of people. You may know, but that doesn't mean you are above the society. So that's, I think we should really put our feet on the ground and think about that way. Anyway, thank you very much, Hocam. I really enjoyed it. But now, floor is yours if you have any questions and comments. But obviously, we have time. Maximum. Peki. Difficult questions for him, please.
Will you field the questions or? Sure.
Thank you. My name is Mehmet Can Akpınar. Thank you for the enticing conversation. When we talk about Islamic education or maybe Muslim education, especially in the earlier period, I think there is an assumption, a hidden assumption, that it's mostly about religious education. Actually, when we think about the Umayyad times, the earliest writings we have are about the education of the crown princes or the princes, the Umayyad princes, and which gives us the first list of kind of curriculum listing, memorizing Quran, learning the Arabic language, legal rulings, poetry, and also accounting, etc. And at the same period, you also see a letter about education of the scribes, the bureaucrats. And these were actually educated by scribes and also religious figures like whom we know, like Zuhri or others. And in the following periods, similar in line with that kind of educational paradigm, we see usually education is limited to a very close circle of people. Even when we talk about Madhahib, Abu Hanifa, it's very small circle of people being educated. So we can, I think, assume that there is an intrinsic element of elitism of education, not for wider population, but only for elect, for few elect. I was wondering how this, the common education, I don't know at what point in time becomes more popular, but this elitist perspective of the earlier period, how would that kind of shape our thinking about Islamic education? Thank you.
It's an excellent question, thank you. And I think your point of emphasizing what historical record we have for the first century to 2 centuries, it's correct to point out both the education of the political elite, if we might call them that, as well as the administrative elite, because of course both in Damascus and then later in what becomes Baghdad, this was indeed with the education of scribes, especially one of the first sources that we have of the literature. But I think we need to frame this within a broader economy of knowledge, so to speak, if I can use that term. Knowledge here meaning not speculative knowledge or knowledge of ulum, but also knowledge of other forms of practice in society. In other words, given that economy and that society, to be educated by learning, formal learning, was not seen as a universal good. If I was an agriculturalist, then my use of that in Nishapur or somewhere else was minimal. It was a virtue. It was always deemed to be a virtue. In other words, to have that ability. But depending on your actual economic activity in society, if you are in a certain trade or craft or other things, then this sense that there's a universal education, as we would call it today, that is something that must be there and cannot not be there, I think wouldn't have made sense at that historical moment. And thus, you're right, it is a form of an elitism. But I think here, once again, when we speak about it in such terms, elite simply in the sense of the reality of that economy of knowledge and of practice of the time in the greater society. I think what you do see nonetheless, and how does, in other words, the ideas develop there, when you have over the centuries, in certain areas, not in all, in certain societies, for example, we have the work of the Barber of Damascus, recently published, I think just about 6-7 years ago, by a scholar in North America, where she shows that, for example, in 15th century Damascus, you even have people who just a few hundred years ago would not have been expected to be writing, let alone be writing the daily histories, and something of even a diary, something that reflects an internal world, as well as an observation on the external world. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you do see in Muslim Spain, or again, in the subcontinent, in Central Asia, at different times, an expansion of education. You see this primarily, and interestingly enough, through the state sponsoring of the Maktab. A Maktab which is children's education, but where the state's role in sponsoring was only for actually the orphans. So in one sense, being poor was one way, and being an orphan was one way actually into education, into having knowledge. So literacy, as we would call it today, was something that indeed did fluctuate in time and in space. But nonetheless, I think some of the principles that the very earliest authors reflected upon, and this is where the moral dimension that our professor here has mentioned at the very beginning of our lecture today, these are things that I think were stable. Whether you were a scribe, whether it was mere for princes literature that was meant to cultivate a certain type of ruler or a certain type of governor, whether it's to the fuqaha, whether it's later to what we would call, again, the natural philosophers or the scientists, those who are working in astronomy under Ulugh Beg and others. This dimension of both the moral on the one hand, but also the integrative nature of knowledge. You pointed out something very important when you mentioned the Kuttab. Again, the word Adab was used there. Now here, Adab had a slightly different connotation, but it was not separate from the moral that we were speaking about. Here, Adab was what we would call being literate, knowing poetry, knowing prose, being able to cite verses of the Quran, but also being able to cite, quote-unquote, secular poetry. But all of this showed a refinement of the soul and of the intellect. And it's this refinement that continues to have that moral element, because something to be refined means that you have a taste. Something is good and something is bad. And this is moral language. Whether it's good or bad architecture, good or bad poetry, or good or bad human being, that you've introduced, by using these terms, you've introduced a degree of moral subjectivity, or moral value, excuse me. And I think this is the constant. This is the constant throughout all the different types of education that you pointed out correctly, from the first century until really the rise of entirely new systems in the 19th century. I'm sorry, for the sake of time, I'm speaking in very broad, maybe painfully broad terms, but it's in order to focus on some of the themes rather than the historical particulars.
But here, if you allow me, just 2 sentences. One is that education did not start with the arrival of Islam. When you look at pre-Islamic Arabia, different forms of training and education took place. But probably what would be unique is a hadith, which is again quoted by Ibn Sahnun, is saying, cursing the teacher who has in the same classroom rich and poor students, and that he favors the rich ones against the poor ones. He said they would be really in the bottom of the hell in the other world. This much they were sensitive not to distinguish between the students just because of their financial background. So I think education in that sense is a different concept. Great.
If I may, this is Ertuğrul Ökten, and it's just great to have you, Professor Al Azem. First of all, I don't think you have addressed enough the question of what's the purpose of education for today. And this I mentioned in your capacity as the director of the Cambridge Muslim Academy. So I'm assuming that you're doing some interesting and exciting stuff over there. And how do you locate institutionally yourself vis-a-vis this question is one of the questions I have in mind. The second issue is maybe we are not treating this issue of adab historically enough. Yes, it has a broad definition, doing the right thing at the right time, but then, for example, critical thinking and criticizing the teacher, is it part of adab or not? Or things, other things maybe. Is there just one adab through the centuries, or is the content, are the contents change and should change from time to time?
If I may with the first one, since you asked reflection upon what experiments happening today in the space of higher education, and trying to bring some of the philosophy, at the very least, as well as the practices of the historical Muslim experience. I think again, a thing that I've tried to raise a number of times in today's discussion, I think the most important element in some of these experiments, such as the Cambridge Muslim College or other institutions, is this issue of, again, integrality. We are in an age in which many, again, even secular or non-religious, if you want to call it, institutions are bemoaning and decrying the fragmentation of knowledge that has happened over the last century or more. Fragmentation, which means that the fruits of one branch of learning, or even within a branch, over specialization in any given field, means that even people interested in that broader field may not be able to know how to reintegrate the fruits of that research or that knowledge back into something bigger than itself. So integrality is very important. And this has been important, again, not just for the Muslim world. If you look at the great universities of the West, Padua and Paris and Bologna and Cambridge and else, and in the United States, other universities from the 1600s elsewhere, all of them were founded originally with the vision that theology is the queen of the sciences. Not because it produces a theologian, but because theology, properly understood, perhaps even going back to pre-Christian times, going back to Aristotelian, other notions of theology, is that which brings everything back into a unitive vision. And from the unitive, you can then descend, so to speak, back down into the particulars, be it in economy or be it in any other branch of knowledge, even if it's not, strictly speaking, religious. In other words, this divide is one that is ultimately seen as harmful. And so often today we think of religious meaning moral, and this is partly the case, but it's not the whole picture. And so I think the question of these experiments, such as the college that you referred to and others, is how do you produce a person who may not go on to become, a religious figure in the traditional sense of being an imam or a khatib or a teacher in a madrasa, but rather somebody who can take that integrative vision, that holistic vision of the world, as we started speaking about, the relationship to the divine, the relationship of human to human, society, sociology, the study of human societies, and ensure now that what we see as revelation, Quran or any other revelatory source, has something to say to these questions. In other words, how do you connect these things together rather than them being fragmented, separate from each other? And when that happens, I think the understanding of even religious education institutions, will come to be seen in a new light. In the same way that, in a sense, they were in the pre-modern imagination of education. So I'm sorry, that's a very long answer to your first question. Your second question, I think the seed of the answer is actually what Professor Wahbi started saying with his story of Abu Hanifa. The notion of adab is that there is always an adab, always a right thing, but adab can change, absolutely, even from moment to moment, let alone from society to society. In other words, what's adab in one moment might be completely distasteful in a different setting. And I think what we see in the famous, historical condition of education of Abu Hanifa and his circle, not just with that particular, but even with Muhammad al-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf and the others, is that his particular circle was noted for this dialectic. And the dialectic meant that they would often criticize back, but with adab. In other words, even in criticism, there's a proper way of criticizing where you still respect the teacher, even if you surpass the teacher. And the teacher comes student has superseded them even, let alone done better than them, but actually superseded them in knowledge. And thus, in different ulum, in different funun, in different crafts, in different practical sciences, there can be different adab. But what unites all of them is the realization that there is a proper order. This is why I began the talk by referencing points of kalam, which say ours is a, logically speaking, philosophically speaking, a realist tradition. In other words, there is an order, there is hierarchy, and some things do serve as governing principles for other things. And this is what unites all the different forms of adab in different historical moments. Again, I know that for a historian, this is maybe not enough granular detail, but within our short amount of time, I'm just trying to throw some things back so I can benefit from the historians who are much better than me in their own fields.
Is there any other question?
I think there was something on this side.
Jazakallah khairan. First of all, for both of you, it was really inspiring. My question is also, apart from the Islamic tradition, also in the history, I'm from Germany actually, and I know particularly Humboldt, and Humboldt has also a kind of holistic understanding of education, which we call in German Bildung. So, but today in this more, let's say, modern world, it's kind of romanticized. So I would just add on this point that this integration of sciences of ulum is very eminent, but we see kind of also that the universities as this pinnacle of institutions are always surrounded, let's say, by foundations like İLKE, like CMC. But I want to hear maybe an outlook for the future, as this was also alluded in the program. What is happening now with the programs like coming artificial intelligence and this more automatization of education? So will we see a decentralization of institutions and which people will really work on? Let's say I'm a programmer and I want just coding, so I don't go to Harvard University, but to a random institution and just gain the skills. Because as you said, also in some anthropological studies, which I did, was the main thesis that a lot of societies were moving from social skills to marketable skills. So these universities opened a door for globalization, kind of. So yeah, just an assessment what these institutions of universities will face in the future. Yeah, that's my question.
Well, probably we should begin with what's the role of Hoca, isn't it? That's where we start, and then the institutions. You continue. I think more they like to hear what you have in, especially in the college that you are running, isn't it?
The questions that you ask, again, a little bit like the very first question again, has to be seen within the framework, I would argue, of, again, the economy, so to speak. By economy, I don't mean financial, I just mean the different parts which are exchanged or things that are given as the basis for everything else that is built upon them. The economy of knowledge that you're referring to, especially with, let's say, automated education or artificial intelligence being applied into education, is something that I would be a fool to try to predict, because even the people at the forefront of this have no idea how this is ultimately going to play out. However, I do think that the some of the forecasting, let's say, of 6-7 years ago, even just before the pandemic, that this is going to usher the destruction of universities, the disappearance of the great universities as we know them, the role of the Hoja, of the teacher, of the human being in it, has so far proven a little bit premature. Premature, why? Because as I think you've seen, as you even alluded to, what do we actually call education today? I mean, even in the 1970s in Britain, let's say, take the country I know a little bit about the educational history, what we refer to as universities back then were vocational colleges. They weren't part of the university system. This was actually something that was merged together all under the university system only in the late 1980s and early 1990s as a shift to neoliberal states and education for neoliberal states. So again, we have to remember the economic, but also the political economy within which institutions of education are being imagined or developed. What will this mean? I think, again, it's too early to say, but I think if we try to do what our host here today asked us to do, which is reflect on the past for the future, I think what we could say, as Professor had just indicated, if it means the taking of the human out of it, I would say that from an Islamic or a Muslim pedagogic or educational philosophy, it would no longer be called ilm. It would no longer be called knowledge. It would no longer be called an education. It would be called maybe technical training, skills training. Some of these things you can learn on your own. Some of these things you can do with just maybe some automation, as you were getting at. But I think that fundamentally, this would no longer be deemed ilm. If, again, it's basically something which the human, and as such, both the integrative and the moral are stripped out. If they are stripped out, and it's, I think, too early to ultimately say. But I think this is where the work of anthropologists who have some of these questions in mind, and I think the new breed of anthropologists are now arising around the world, where they're familiar with some of these philosophies from globally, Muslim and otherwise, and they're bringing them to bear upon questions such as education in a modern, technologized, neoliberal society. I think we'll find some of the answers actually through your research, hopefully.
I guess we are ending. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the discussions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.